happy 262nd birthday, Alexander Hamilton. Thank you, Reverend Bennett, for hosting this talk in the historic John Street Methodist Church, the oldest continuing Methodist congregation in the nation since 1766. The Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, or for short, YAHA Society, has reviewed just under 90 books on Alexander Hamilton. And with a musical, many more are on their way. We're asked, how credible are these new books? How do they compare to others? Which are the best? One such book arrived in late 2017, and that was Alexander Hamilton and the Development of American Law by Kate Elizabeth Brown. There's been much progress recently with the nation learning about Alexander Hamilton's key roles in the founding era. Father of the Coast Guard, the Major General of the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Marines. He managed a suffocating debt, architected a financial system that fueled economic growth and that resulted in strong credit. All that Hamilton did, there was some sophistication to all of it. There was much opposition to much of it. And the opposing party took the leadership reins for the next 40 years. So, how did Hamilton's vision and foundations remain in place then and still today? We're about to hear. Dr. Brown has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and research grants, including a James C. Reese Fellowship for the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington at Mount Vernon, and a fellowship at the esteemed Gilda Lehrman Institute for American History right here in New York City. We are truly privileged to hear some highlights from this book by its author, Dr. Kate Elizabeth Brown. Dr. Brown.
When I wrote this book, the way I approached it was first thinking about Hamilton and realizing that we know Hamilton really well. He's a well-known figure. And we know him as a statesman and a policy maker. And we know him as a party chief. And we know him as Washington's right-hand man during war and in peacetime. But Hamilton's contemporaries would have thought of him first and foremost as a lawyer, and an outstanding one at that. And in the 21st century, I just didn't think that Hamilton's reputation as a lawyer was really well known, and I wanted to remedy that. So my book is partly about Hamilton as a lawyer, and also partly about how Hamilton helped to develop American law over time. And so in my talk today, I've selected 3 different episodes from Hamilton's law practice. First, when he first starts to practice law in New York in the 1780s, then when he is Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington, and then finally, I'm looking forward in time after his death to ask what's his legal legacy. And so I'd like to begin today with Hamilton as a lawyer in private practice, a minted lawyer in New York in the 1780s. And his focus is being an advocate for loyalists who are unfortunately persecuted, hated groups of people in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. And what we're going to see is that Alexander Hamilton becomes an advocate for them, but also an advocate for all sorts of rights and liberties, and most importantly, the due process of law for all New Yorkers. But before I start talking about Hamilton and his particular legal strategy involving the Loyalists, I need to tell you a little bit about New York during the war and after. Because New York State, just like all of the other colonies turned states, experienced the Revolutionary War as a sort of civil war, where families are torn apart, neighbors start to hate each other depending upon what side you're taking, the British Crown versus the Patriots. And New York was no different, but it was different in the sense that New York was geographically split as well. Because beginning in 1776, the British Army came and occupied New York City and held it for the duration of the war. So that means that part of New York State is under the control of one sovereign, the British Army, and the other part of the state is under the control of the centrally-controlled government. And this had an effect on the people of New York. Because imagine, if you're a patriot and you want to align yourself with the independence cause, you're not going to want to stick around in New York City. You're going to want to get up and go to where you won't be harassed and where you can help win this revolution. But the flip side is also true, because if you're a loyalist, you are going to want to seek the protection of the British Army. And so you have a movement of people, some moving into New York and some moving out of it. Now, in the meantime, the Patriot-controlled New York State government passes a number of statutes intent on harassing and punishing and denying rights and due process of law to those loyalists. And in total, there's something like 30 statutes, a number of statutes, but there are 3 I want to talk about today, because these 3 statutes are not only extremely effective, but they figure prominently in Hamilton's law practice. The first of these statutes is called the Trespass Act, and it's passed right at the end of the war in 1783. And in order for you to understand why the Trespass Act is just so effective at harassing loyalists, let me take you back again to what it was like in occupied New York during the war. Remember, there are people who are coming into the city who are displaced. They're loyalists, leaving their homes behind to seek protection under the British Army. So they left their property behind them, and when they show up in New York, they see all of this vacant property left behind by patriots. Vacant storehouses, vacant warehouses, vacant taverns and tap rooms, all kinds of businesses. And they now need to make a living. So, under the law of nations, which is a general legal set of guidelines that Great Britain adheres to, if those loyalists go to the commanding sovereign, the British Army, and say, during this occupation, can I use an abandoned warehouse or tavern? And if that occupying sovereign gives them that permission, then, under the law of nations, those loyalists can use that property, even though it's not theirs, and they get some kind of immunity after the war, so that they can't be held liable for trespassing on property that wasn't their own. That's how it should have worked. But, remember I said the Trespass Act is really effective. What the New York State Legislature does in the Trespass Act is it denies loyalists that defense. And that defense is called, it's referred to as the defense of military permission. And the Trespass Act basically says, loyalists, you are now on the hook for all kinds of trespass liability. You can't use the defense that you thought you could. So that's number 1. Number 2, the second statute that was really effective at harassing, punishing, and denying due process to loyalists is called the Confiscation Act. And this was passed during the war in 1779, and it basically amounts to a bill of attainder, which means that the statute names certain loyalists, just flat out names them, and declares them to be enemies of the state, and therefore the state can confiscate their property. Now, this is not a taking with just compensation. This is just stealing. The state gets your property. And the language of the Confiscation Act is broad enough so that even if you weren't named in the statute, but you were still determined to be an enemy of the state, your property would be confiscated as well. And the final act that I'd like to make note of is called the Citation Act. This is passed in 1782. And this is an act that basically makes it such that debtors who tended to be patriots can wiggle out of their contractual obligations from merchants and creditors who tended to be loyalists. Now, Alexander Hamilton passes the appropriate bar exams in New York between 1782 and 1783. And when he burst onto the scene as a lawyer, of men, a class of professionals who are involved in commerce. And we all know that Hamilton appreciates a commercial republic, right? Not an agrarian republic, but a commercial republic where bankers and merchants and those involved in the carrying trade are growing our economy. So that's one reason. The second reason is that Hamilton genuinely feels that in a new republic, where we've just gotten rid of one tyrant, the British king, we shouldn't replace the British king with another tyrant, the rule of the majority, that feels empowered to take away rights from a minority group. But he knows it won't be easy. And in fact, in the 1790s, around 1795, Alexander Hamilton will write a letter to George Washington. And in this letter, he is going to reflect on just what it was like to be an advocate for the Loyalists. And he's honest with Washington, and he says, it's tough. Partly it's tough because of the fact that only a handful of New York lawyers, then as now, New York is crawling with lawyers, but only a handful of them are willing to take on the Loyalists as a claim. That is how much the Loyalists are hated. And so that's tough. But also these acts, the three in particular I mentioned before, they're really effective. So it's tough to find a way to defend your clients. Nevertheless, Hamilton does come up with a multi-pronged legal strategy, and here the goal for him is to try to mitigate or to circumvent the effects of these anti-loyalists. And so I'd like to just take you briefly through the highlights of his legal strategy. First, Hamilton comes up with novel defenses. And this is trying to circumvent the effects of the Trespass Act. And the two novel defenses he comes up with, one is called the Plea of the Law of Nations. The other is called the Plea of the Treaty of Peace, making reference to the Treaty of Peace that ended the Revolutionary War. And here's how the logic goes. New York State statute has taken away the defense of military permission from loyalists, so they could get out of, so that they were liable for their trespasses during the war. But Hamilton argues that law is part of a hierarchy, and there is higher law that trumps New York State statutes. And the Treaty of Peace is a higher law, and the Law of Nations is a higher law. And since, he argues, both sources of law give his clients, loyalists, access to a military permission defense, they should have access to it. Now, in a really famous case that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, it's called Rutgers versus Waddington, Hamilton rolls this argument out, and the New York Mayor's Court buys some of it. The court will agree with Hamilton that the Law of Nations does supply a defense of military permission. They don't buy the Treaty of Peace stuff. But you know what? That's fine for Hamilton because it's good enough that the Law of Nations gives his client this defense, and he can tap into it, and he is able to get justice for his client. So that's the first part of the strategy. Hamilton also advises his clients to delay litigation whenever possible. And here, Hamilton is sort of playing the long game, and he's thinking that really the solution to these anti-loyalist statutes is for time to pass, for people to forget about the war as much as they can, and for them to change the law. And so until that happens, it's best, if you can, to avoid going to court at all. But sometimes that can't happen. So Hamilton advises his clients to settle out of court whenever possible. Because then as now, you'll probably get a better deal if you're an unpopular plaintiff, or unpopular defendant rather, if you can kind of make your own deal rather than put it in front of the jury that hates you. Okay, Hamilton's next part of his the multi-pronged strategy is private petitions to the state legislatures. This strategy is not meant to change the law, but it's meant to get some exceptions to the law. And it doesn't work for every client, but for example, Hamilton has a client who is a widow with children, and during the war, her husband was attainted under the Confiscation Act, which means the family's property was taken by the state. But now the widow is destitute, and she's pretty sympathetic, and so Hamilton has to write up a petition. He presents this to the legislature and says, she's not really an enemy of the state, and she's just a poor woman with her children. Can we cut her some slack? And the assembly does. So it works. But it wouldn't work with every client. Nevertheless, it does get justice for that one particular client. As any good lawyer would do, Hamilton exploits technicality whenever he can get his clients off the hook. And when worse comes to worse, Hamilton engages in a public letter writing campaign. And here he writes these two brilliant articles under the pseudonym Potion. And it's to the people of New York. And basically what he argues is, New Yorkers, I know you hate the loyalists, but you don't want to start this precedent. You don't want to start the precedent that any persecuted minority can lose their legal rights. Maybe now it feels good, but you never know. Maybe a day from now, maybe a year from now, maybe a decade from now, you will be part of that minority, and you don't want your rights taken away. So don't start it now. Hamilton is right about one thing, that it wouldn't be too long before the law changes. And indeed, before Hamilton goes off to be the first Secretary of the Treasury, the law of New York State has changed. The anti-loyalist statutes are revoked or modified, and New York State adopts a Bill of Rights that specifically gives all New Yorkers the right to the due process of law. Now, I start with this episode because I think, at least in my experience, framers and statesmen like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they usually get most of the credit for being the founders interested in preserving rights. And Hamilton, he often gets the reputation of being an elitist, period. But I think these first early years and then the rest of his private practice demonstrates that Alexander Hamilton was very interested in preserving the rights and liberties of Americans. And his first foray into practicing law, that's exactly what he did.